The laughter started before the auctioneer even finished her name. Clara stood on the cracked wooden stage, hands clenched tight, her face burning beneath the torn lace veil they'd thrown over her head like a dirty rag. "Ugliest bride the West ever saw," someone shouted, and the crowd howled with cruel delight. They'd dragged her here from the poorhouse, dressed her in a ruined wedding gown, and pinned a crooked sign across her chest. "Too ugly to marry. No dowry, no family, no future. Just a cruel joke to entertain the ranchers and drifters gathered under the noon sun." The auctioneer chuckled as he called out, "Who'll take her home, boys? Come on, give the lady a laugh before supper." Hands waved mockingly. "A bucket of mud! Half a wagon wheel? My old boots and a debt note." Clara kept her chin high, even as the shame clawed at her throat. If she cried, they'd win. If she ran, they'd chase her. She had nothing left but what little pride she hadn't pawned for bread. Then, through the cruel jokes and spitting dust, a voice rose, calm, deep, and slow. $1 silver. Silence fell like a hammer. Every head turned. At the edge of the square, leaning against a chestnut mare, stood a man no one expected to bid. Tall, broad-shouldered, his face shaded beneath a worn black hat, he looked more shadow than man. But when he stepped forward, the light caught the scar running from his brow to his cheek. Quiet, jagged, and earned. Luke Turner. The quietest rancher in the valley. A widower, some whispered. Others said loner. No one knew much, and no one laughed when he spoke. He dropped a silver coin at the auctioneer's feet and looked Clara in the eye. Steady, sure, without a trace of pity. "Come with me," he said, offering his hand. The crowd waited for him to laugh, to yank his hand away, to finish the cruel joke they'd started. But Luke only stood there, patient and still. Clara stared at his hand, unsure whether to trust it. But when she glanced at the crowd and saw the smirking faces, she realized her choice wasn't between freedom and captivity. It was between cruelty and quiet. She placed her hand in his. Rough, warm, steady. Luke helped her down from the stage as if she were a queen. And when they passed the crowd, he spoke loud enough for all to hear. "Ain't nothing ugly about a woman looking for a second chance." And for the first time, no one laughed. They rode in silence for most of the afternoon, the sun sinking low behind the hills as dust trailed behind Luke's horse. Clara sat stiff in the saddle, the tattered wedding dress billowing in the breeze, every mile stretching farther from the laughter but closer to a different kind of unknown. She stole a glance at Luke, his face unreadable beneath the brim of his hat. He hadn't spoken since they left the square, but his quiet wasn't cruel. It felt more like space, room to breathe after a lifetime of suffocation. Finally, unable to bear the silence any longer, she spoke. "Why'd you do it?" He didn't look at her, just kept his gaze fixed on the winding trail ahead. "Because they didn't think anyone would." She frowned, gripping the reins tighter. "I'm not some cause to be pitied." "Didn't say you were." His voice was calm, almost gentle. "I just thought you deserved a place where no one's laughing but you." The words caught her off guard. No one had spoken to her like that, like she was more than a punchline. As the sun dipped below the ridge, they crested a hill, and the ranch came into view. A modest cabin tucked between rolling fields and weathered fences. Smoke curled from the chimney, soft and inviting. It wasn't much, but it was the first place that hadn't tried to sell her worth for a laugh. Luke dismounted and tied the horse to a post, then turned to help her down. She hesitated. "I can do it myself." He nodded, respecting the words, and stepped back. She slid down, nearly stumbling as her tired legs hit the ground. He caught her elbow, steady but gentle, and let go as soon as she found her footing. Inside, the cabin was simple. A worn table, 2 chairs, a crackling fire, and a bed with a handmade quilt. He poured her a tin cup of water and handed it to her without a word. She drank, the coolness washing away the dust of the day. Finally he spoke, voice steady and sure. "You can stay as long as you want, or leave tomorrow if that's what you choose." She blinked at him, surprised. "You mean I'm free to go?" He gave a slow nod. "You were never mine to keep." In that moment, the weight of the sign she'd worn, the laughter, the shame, it all felt a little lighter. She wasn't a prisoner here, just a woman finally given a choice. And for the first time in years, she didn't know whether to run or to rest. The morning light poured through the cracked window, warming the cabin's rough-hewn walls. Clara awoke, tangled in the quilt, her wedding dress folded neatly at the foot of the bed. She blinked, confused at first by the absence of shouting or cruel laughter. The only sound was the crackle of bacon on the stove and the low hum of a man working without expecting thanks. She found Luke outside splitting wood, sleeves rolled up, his movements steady and practiced. He paused when he saw her, wiping sweat from his brow. "Mornin', Clara." No one had said her name like that in years. Plain, simple, without mockery or pity. She swallowed the lump in her throat. "Good morning." They ate in quiet companionship, the kind where no words are needed to fill the spaces. When she offered to wash the dishes, he simply nodded, neither surprised nor dismissive. Afterward, he saddled his horse and grabbed his tools. "I'll be mending the south fence. Cabin's yours if you want it, no locks." She hesitated. "You trust me not to steal your things?" He met her gaze, steady and calm. A woman sold as a joke has nothing left to steal. The truth of it settled heavy in her chest. After he left, Clara wandered the ranch. Chickens scratched in the yard. A tired barn leaned against the wind. Wildflowers stretched along the fence line, defiant against the harsh earth. She found a pile of old clothes in a trunk, plain but sturdy, and traded her wedding dress for a faded cotton blouse and worn trousers. The dress, once her cage, now folded away in a corner like a shed skin. By midday, she was feeding the chickens, patching a torn curtain, and scrubbing dust from the windows. No one asked her to. No one mocked her effort. She just did it. When Luke returned at dusk, a quiet smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "Place looks lived in." She shrugged, wiping sweat from her brow. Figured it was about time it did. He built the fire higher that night, the warmth filling the space between them. She sat by the hearth, sewing a patch on his work shirt without asking if it was wanted. "Why'd you stay alone all these years?" she asked softly. He stared into the flames, the shadows deepening the lines of his face. "I reckon I was waiting for something worth sharing it with." Her needle paused mid-stitch, her heart stumbling just a little. For once, the silence between them wasn't heavy. It felt like the start of something waiting to be named. Peace lasted 3 days before the town came calling. Clara was hanging laundry on the line when she heard the riders, 3 men from the auction square, dust trailing behind them, grins sharp as razors. They didn't bother knocking. They stopped at the fence, boots resting easy in their stirrups, voices loud enough for the whole valley to hear. "Well, look who made herself a cozy little nest," one sneered. "Ugly girl plays house with the loneliest rancher in the county." Another spat into the dirt. "We figured he'd send her packing once the joke wore off. Guess he's softer than we thought." Clara felt the shame rise like bile, but she held her ground. "This is my home now. You've no business here." The first man laughed, cruel and sharp. "A home? He bought you for a silver coin, girl. Don't forget what you are." She clenched the laundry basket tighter, fingers trembling, but before she could answer, Luke's voice cut through the tension like a blade. "That's far enough." He stood on the porch, rifle resting in his hands, face calm but cold. "Turn your horses around." The men shifted uneasily. They'd expected silence, maybe tears. They hadn't expected him to stand for her. "Come on, Turner," the leader jeered. "We was just having a laugh. Can't take a joke?" Luke's gaze didn't waver. "A joke's only funny when both sides are laughing. She ain't." For a long moment, the only sound was the wind snapping through the clothesline. Then the lead rider spat again, turned his horse, and rode off without another word. The others followed, dust rising in their wake. Clara let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Luke lowered the rifle but didn't put it away. "They'll be back." She gathered the laundry, her voice steadier than she felt. "Let them come. I'm done running from laughter." He watched her for a moment, something soft flickering beneath his guarded eyes. "You don't have to fight them alone." She managed a small smile. "I know." That evening, as they ate by the fire, Clara spoke without looking up. "Thank you for standing up for me." Luke's voice was quiet but sure. "A man stands where he finds his heart." The words settled between them, warm and steady. She looked across the table, the glow of the lantern softening the scar on his cheek. Maybe ugly wasn't a thing worn on a face. Maybe it was what lived in the hearts of men who couldn't see past one. And maybe, just maybe, someone had finally seen her true. The first winter storm rolled over the valley like a warning. Snow fell thick and fast, blanketing the ranch in silence and cold. Inside the cabin, Clara worked beside Luke without being asked. She mended torn gloves, stacked firewood, and stirred thick stews that warmed their bones when the wind howled at night. For the first time in years, her hands worked for something that felt like home. The days passed quietly but full. Luke repaired the roof while Clara patched the holes in their coats. When a neighbor's calf was found stranded in the snow, Luke saddled his horse and rode out without hesitation. And Clara had hot coffee waiting when he returned, soaked and shivering but grinning all the same. One evening, as snow piled against the windows, Luke sat carving a wooden figure by the fire. Clara watched his hands, steady and careful. "What are you making?" she asked softly. He turned it toward her. A small horse, rough but sturdy. "For you." Thought the mantle looked empty. No one had ever made her anything before. Not a dress, not a flower, not a toy. And here, in this quiet cabin at the edge of nowhere, a scarred rancher had carved her a horse, simply because he thought it belonged beside her. She placed it gently on the mantle, smiling to herself. Outside, the wind screamed through the trees, but inside, the storm could not touch them. Later, as they sat by the fading fire, Clara spoke the fear she'd carried since the auction. "When the snow melts, when the road clears, will you still want me here?" Luke didn't answer right away. He placed another log on the fire, watching the sparks rise into the chimney. "This ain't about charity, Clara. Never was." She looked at her hands, worn and calloused now from work instead of shame. "Then what is it?" He turned to her, voice low but steady. "You're not a burden here. You're what this place needed." The words melted something frozen inside her. She had been sold as a joke, as broken, as worthless. But here, in this cabin built by quiet hands and steady hearts, she was wanted. Not because she was perfect, but because she was enough. That night, as the fire burned low and the storm raged on, Clara drifted to sleep beside the only man who'd ever called her beautiful, without saying the word aloud. And for the first time in forever, she didn't dream of running. She dreamed of spring, Spring came slow but sure, melting the snow in wide patches and sending wildflowers crawling across the hills like forgotten promises. Clara planted a small garden outside the cabin, rows of beans and squash where only dust had lived before. Luke built her a fence to keep the rabbits out, whistling softly while he worked. Life had settled into something steady until the day two strangers rode down the ridge. She spotted them first from the garden, one tall and sharp-eyed, the other younger but no less dangerous in the way he scanned the land. Town men. Not drifters, not traders. Clara wiped her hands on her skirt and met them halfway down the trail. "Afternoon, ma'am," the older one said, tipping his hat without warmth. "We're looking for a man named Luke Turner. Heard he's harboring a woman sold at auction. Some folks back in town claim she belongs to them." Clara's stomach turned, but her voice didn't shake. "I belong to no one." The younger man laughed, cold and thin. "That ain't what the bill of sale says." Luke stepped out from the barn then, wiping oil from his hands, rifle resting casually against the wall behind him. "You're trespassing?" The older man smiled without kindness. "We're just here to collect what's ours." Luke's voice was quiet but sharp. "She was never yours, and she's not leaving." For a moment, the wind seemed to stop. The birds fell silent. The younger man spat into the dirt. "You think this little patch of land keeps you safe from the law?" Luke took a step forward, calm as steady rain. "Law is only as strong as the hands holding it, and mine don't shake." The men exchanged a glance, weighing the rifle, the rancher's quiet resolve, and the woman standing beside him with fire in her eyes. They turned their horses without another word, dust trailing behind them as they disappeared back toward town. Clara let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Luke picked up the rifle and leaned it back against the barn like it was just another tool. "They'll be back," she said quietly. He nodded. "Probably." "And when they come?" He looked at her, something soft beneath the steady steel of his gaze. "Then we'll remind them we built this place with more than fear." That night, as dusk stretched across the hills, Clara planted the last row of seeds, each one a quiet promise that they wouldn't run. Not from laughter, not from cruelty, and not from men who'd already lost their claim on her heart. The men from town didn't return, alone. A week later, as the sun sank low behind the hills, Clara heard the thunder of hooves and the crack of rifle butts against fence posts. 6 men this time, faces masked with scarves and rage. They didn't call out. They didn't warn. They lit the chicken coop first, flames rising fast against the twilight sky. Smoke curled over the garden Clara had planted with her own hands. Luke burst from the barn, rifle raised, eyes scanning the shadows. "Get inside!" he shouted, but Clara didn't move. "This is my home too." He didn't argue. They stood shoulder to shoulder on the porch, firelight flickering across their faces. A voice called out from beyond the flames. "Give us the girl, Turner, and we leave your land in one piece." Clara stepped forward, voice steady. "I ain't a girl, and I ain't going anywhere." The laughter that followed was sharp and mean. "You think this ranch makes you somebody? You're still what we sold!" Luke fired first, a warning shot cracking through the night. Silence fell for a heartbeat. Then chaos. Bullets tore through the fence. The barn door splintered, but Clara and Luke stood fast, firing only when they saw the whites of cruel eyes. Minutes stretched like hours, until the men, startled by resistance they hadn't expected, began to retreat. One rider fell. Another dropped his torch and fled. By dawn, the fire was out, smoke rising from blackened earth. The coop was gone, the barn half burned, but the cabin still stood, and so did they. Clara collapsed on the porch, lungs burning, hands trembling. Luke knelt beside her, wiping soot from her cheek. You held your ground. Tears burned her eyes, but she smiled through them. I finally had something worth holding. They buried the dead rider near the creek, marking his grave with a simple stone. Luke said no words over the body. Men who lived by cruelty found their own judgment. That night, as they sat by the blackened remains of their barn, Luke spoke softly. They won't forget this. Clara rested her head against his shoulder. Neither will we. The stars stretched endless above them, silent witnesses to a battle that wasn't about land or pride, but about a woman who had finally been seen as more than what a crowd once called her. Tomorrow they would rebuild. Not because the world gave them permission, but because they chose each other again and again. No matter the cost, spring faded into early summer, and where the ashes once settled, life began to stir again. Luke rebuilt the barn, board by board, while Clara tended the new chicks delivered by a neighbor who'd heard about the fire and said nothing. Just dropped the crate at the fence and rode off. Acts of kindness spoke louder than words in these parts. Clara planted new seeds where the fire had burned through her garden, fingers in the dirt, heart steady in her chest. Each sprout felt like defiance, a quiet answer to the men who tried to burn her life down. Some days they worked in silence, sweat and sunlight filling the spaces where fear used to live. Other days they laughed, soft, surprised laughter, as if remembering what it felt like to smile without looking over their shoulders. Luke built a new porch swing from leftover timber, hanging it from the cabin eaves where the breeze could catch it just right. Clara found herself sitting there most evenings, sewing shirts for Luke and humming a tune no one ever taught her. One afternoon, as she rocked gently beneath the golden sky, Luke stepped onto the porch and sat beside her. For a while, neither spoke. Then, without looking at her, he asked, "You ever think about getting married proper?" The question caught her mid-stitch, heart thudding hard. "I thought I was already married. To the dirt, to shame, to what they called me in town." He gave a small, crooked smile. "That ain't a marriage. That's a sentence." She looked at him then. Really looked. The scar on his cheek, the quiet in his eyes. The man who paid a silver dollar to stop a cruel joke and never once asked her for anything in return. "And what would marrying you mean?" she whispered. He rested his elbows on his knees, staring out at the sunset. "Means you ain't owned. Means you chose. Means when folks call your name, you know who you belong to, and who belongs to you." Tears welled before she could stop them. Not because she felt claimed like property, but because, for the first time, belonging didn't feel like a cage. She smiled, soft and sure. "Then I suppose you should ask properly." He turned to her, that quiet, steady smile breaking through the scar. "Clara, will you be my wife, proper and true?" Her voice trembled but didn't break. "Yes, Luke Turner, yes." And as the sun dipped below the hills, painting their rebuilt home in gold, they sealed their promise beneath a sky too wide to hold all that they were building. They married beneath the open sky, without church bells or fine silk, but with the wind carrying their vows and the earth holding their steps steady. Luke wore his cleanest shirt, scar unhidden. Clara wore a plain blue dress, no veil, no painted face, just a quiet smile earned through every hardship. A few neighbors came, farmers who knew loss, widows who knew laughter's sharp edge, and stood beside them in quiet respect. But word traveled fast, and by noon, half the town gathered at the ridge, not as guests but as witnesses to something they never thought they'd see. The too ugly bride, sold as a cruel joke, standing proud and loved in front of the quiet rancher no one could shame. The same men who once jeered at her now shifted uncomfortably on the outskirts, unsure whether to laugh or leave. Clara faced them without flinching. "You sold me for a silver coin," she called out, her voice steady. "But today, I was given something your money could never buy." Luke rested his hand gently on her back. "Respect." Silence settled over the ridge. Some lowered their eyes. A few turned their horses and rode away, their power lost where cruelty no longer ruled. The preacher, a kind-eyed man who'd said nothing at the auction, stepped forward and offered his blessing without condition or expectation. "May your home stand longer than the laughter of fools." That night, back at the cabin, they ate bread. Clara baked herself and drank coffee by the fire, content in a way neither thought possible. The scarred rancher and the woman no one wanted, now husband and wife by choice, not by circumstance. Later, as they watched the stars blink into view, Clara asked softly, "Do you think they'll ever forget what they called me?" Luke shook his head, voice gentle. "They might never forget. But someday their children will hear a different story." "And what story is that?" she whispered. He smiled, brushing a strand of hair from her cheek. "That the ugliest bride became the heart of this valley, not because she changed, but because someone finally saw her right." Tears filled her eyes, but they were warm, not bitter. She rested her head against his shoulder, the night soft around them. In the end, they didn't erase the laughter of that cruel auction. They simply built a life that spoke louder. And for Clara Turner, that was enough. Seasons turned, and so did the whispers. Over time, folks stopped calling her the ugly bride and started calling her Mrs. Turner, the woman who nursed sick calves in the spring, shared warm bread in winter, and held the lonely corners of the valley together like stitches in a worn quilt. She didn't ask for respect, but she earned it. And the ranch that had once been Luke's refuge became something more, a home where people gathered, not because they had nowhere else to go, but because the Turners' door was always open. Children played in the fields she'd planted, their laughter chasing away the ghosts of old cruelty. Travelers stopped at their well for a drink and left with stories of the rancher and his wife who built something beautiful from nothing but dust and shame. And when the town gathered for the spring market, Clara stood beside Luke, head high, voice clear, selling jars of honey and quilts stitched by her own hand. The same men who once bid for her like a broken mule now tipped their hats in quiet apology. But Clara didn't need their regret. She had built a life they could never steal. One afternoon, years after the auction square fell silent, a young girl asked her, "Is it true, ma'am, that they sold you because you weren't pretty enough to marry?" Clara smiled gently, kneeling to meet the girl's wide, innocent eyes. "It's true they sold me, child. But no one gets to decide what you're worth but you." The girl beamed, running off with a jar of honey clutched in her arms, her laughter carrying across the ridge. That night, as dusk softened the sky, Clara and Luke sat on the porch swing they'd built together. The fields swayed in the breeze, wildflowers blooming where once only ash remained. Luke rested his hand over hers, scarred fingers rough but warm. "Do you ever miss what might have been?" he asked softly. She leaned her head against his shoulder, a quiet smile playing on her lips. "I don't waste time missing things that were never meant for me." He kissed her temple, slow and sure. "You built something better." She closed her eyes, breathing in the scent of earth and wood smoke. "We did." And as the stars blinked alive overhead, they sat together in the quiet they chose, wrapped not in riches or praise, but in the kind of love no cruel joke could ever break, a love quietly built, fiercely kept, beautiful in ways the world had no words for.